Ongoing shir on Bassi Legani, which is focusing on the sixth paragraph of the original series written in 1950 by the previous Rebbe. The theme of the mimer of that original paragraph is concept of humility, bittul. And he talks about the letter Daled and the letter Resh, how they both mean poverty, connected to someone who has nothing. But although they seem similar both in design and in translation, they are completely different because the Daled has that little yud. That little yud on the back of the Daled shows on the humility of kiddush, of holiness. The lack of the yud shows on poverty, but it doesn't show on humility. It's lacking godliness. So one is humble before godliness, one is lacking godliness. In the next chapter, chapter number 5, he associates that Daled, that little yud, with the sphera, the attribute of God's malchus, what we call sovereignty. Now, sovereignty, on one hand, represents hisnasus, which means one who dominates. What does it have to do with humility? But the truth is that the sphera of malchus, les lo migarmo klum, and he has the ability to diminish itself. In fact, it must diminish itself. Because when you say you are king, what makes you king? Oh, because you have more chachma, more wisdom than the other fellow. Because you're nicer, you're stronger. You have more chachma, more chesed, more gevura. So malchus on its own has no reality until it becomes a keli that it receives from above. That is the concept of malchus, the humility to accept from those which are above you. That's one side. On the other side of the coin, malchus has also a different kind of humility. It must humble itself to create. Because we're talking about the malchus of the world of Atzilus. Atzilus is a world that is Eitzel, next to God. For it to create a world like Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, those worlds are so insignificant that it must be mitzamtzum, it must diminish, it must humble itself in order to be a king over them. So these are the two sides of Malchus's humility. It's a receiver, and it must humble itself to be a giver to those that are much less than he himself. The second aspect of this paragraph, we're talking about paragraph number 5, is that Malchus not only has to humble itself, Malchus actually is created from those below it. Let's think about a usual king. We find the first king of Israel, King Saul, did not want to be king until the people said to him, "We want you king." And the acceptance by the people below is what makes you a king. So God is really already king, so to speak. The Malchus of Atzilus is already king. But those below it, what's called Hala Asman, their expression, and they're elevating themselves from below to above. The neshamas below, the angels below, all creation below reaches up to God, and they are machazek. They strengthen God's desire to want to be a melech. The last part of chapter 5 talks about the difference between these two kinds of humility. Malchus receiving from above, and Malchus receiving from below. In order to have Malchus, in order to create Malchus, it must receive from above. Because as we just mentioned, Malchus, before it receives from above, is not a king. It's only a king in theory. What makes you the king is because you receive from above. So Malchus, to be built from the outset, requires to humble itself in order to become a king. The second part of that humility is after it already has the talent to be king. In order to strengthen the fellow's desire to want to be our king, in this case God's desire, we must reach up from above, from below to above. So the idea of the humility of Malchus is not merely a prerequisite, it's an ongoing character that permeates Malchus from before it's born throughout its giving. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed chapter 5.